The colors you choose to use in your renders can have a massive effect on the overall mood and the kind of feelings you want to invoke in the picture. But I think maybe more importantly, it also can really dictate how good the picture is and how pleasing it is to look at, and whether when somebody looks at it, they think it's nice and it looks like eye candy, or whether it just looks gross and overwhelming and just not nice at all to look at and kind of annoying. So in this video, I want to show you some of my favorite techniques of how I choose colors and some really easy methods to do that don't clash, and how I use Photoshop to just drill in the exact colors that I want and really push it to the limits without going too far. So yeah, let's just talk about some interesting ways to use color in Blender and Photoshop and how I balance all that, and yeah, let's get into it. All right, so there's a bunch of different methods and ways you can choose colors, but I think that one of the easiest ways to just pick nice colors that go together is just start with one main color, I guess like the base color of the image, and then just go directly across the color spectrum and just choose something that's on the other side of the spectrum. I'll show you in a second what I mean here. But if you just go across the spectrum and choose something that's on the opposite side to kind of balance it out, that's a very easy way to get colors that look nice together. So it doesn't really matter where on the spectrum you start. Like any color can look good, but it just depends on what other colors or color you choose to pair with it that kind of influences how it feels and how everything looks. So for example, in this one right here, the main color that's happening here is this kind of orangey red kind of thing. I'm just using the eyedropper and I'm just clicking around, and you can see in the color wheel here, anywhere I click, that's going to show you exactly what color I've just selected. So if we go to the center here, it's this very bright, vibrant, orangey red kind of color. And if we look on the color wheel here, it might be hard to see, but there's this little white circle right here that shows the hue that I have selected. If we go directly across the spectrum here to over here, the opposite color of that is this blue right here, right? And so if you look at what other color I've used in here, if I click on here, it's blue. It's pretty close to right there. So you'll notice it's not the exact opposite. Like a lot of, if you've ever watched a video on like color theory and you'll see people doing these diagrams and stuff, they'll show you like the mathematically perfect exact opposite color to choose. It doesn't need to be like that exact or anything. It just needs to be roughly on the opposite side-ish of the spectrum. That's a pretty easy way to get nice complementary colors. So again, here's that orange. Directly across is going to be somewhere, and pretty much anywhere in here. I could have chosen kind of anywhere along here, and it would look nice. And that's exactly what I did. So another way you can use this is you can kind of, again, you don't have to be that accurate with it. So here's another example. The main color that's happening here is this kind of pink kind of section here. And then opposite to this pink section would be kind of like a cyan or green blue. So you can look, and that's what's happening here. We've got this, if I click here, lots of like blue, cyan, green. So, you know, I think you could technically count this as like a split complementary, where it's not going directly across the spectrum. It's kind of splitting into, if we look at, I actually have a diagram here. So a split complementary is like where you have one color, and then instead of going directly opposite the spectrum, so like yellow directly opposite to like a pink or like magenta, you would split it into the colors on either side of that. So for example, I'm kind of doing that here. In this one right here, we're starting with that very saturated pink right here. Directly opposite to that would be kind of in between blue and green, and that's kind of what's happening here. I'm kind of using a bit more on the green side and also a bit more on the blue side. Now I'm showing you like a very technical approach to this, but to be honest, that I was not thinking about any of this while I was making this. I was just trying to find colors that looked cool, and I just happened to stumble across these colors right here, and those just looked good. And I only realized after that I guess they are complementary colors that make sense to go together, but in the moment of making this, I wasn't like analyzing this mathematically and like trying to do some formula to get these colors. I just stumbled across this and went with that because it looked good. But so don't think you have to like overanalyze this and do like math while you're doing this. Just pick what looks good. But if you're not sure at all what to pick, a general trick that you can do that usually looks good is just the main color you're using. Again, just go across the spectrum, so the opposite of that to like there somewhere, or you can start anywhere on here, like any color, just go opposite of that. That will generally look good with the color you start with. Another thing to note is when you have a very strong color like this, or two very strong colors that are complementary to each other, I think it's a good idea to not have it like 50% one color and 50% the other color. So for example, in this one, I've kind of outlined what section of the image is the main pink color and what section of the image is that blue-green kind of color. So I've just done a scribble over here. This red separator line is kind of where that the border is. But if you just look at think about what percentage or like what area of the image is actually that pink color, it's actually not 50-50. It's mostly pink, right? It's over probably 70-80% this pink section or pink kind of colors. And then only 25% or less of the picture is that blue cyan kind of color. So if you have 50%, if I had it like 50% pink and 50% blue, for some reason, that just doesn't look as nice as if you have one dominant color and then have one complementary color that's just kind of in there a little bit to kind of balance it out, but not necessarily compete with it, like 50% blue, 50% pink. Obviously, do what you want, but as a general rule of thumb, I find that looks a lot better when you don't have it half and half. I think it's nicer to have like mostly one color that's kind of taking over most of the scene, and then one color that just balances out a little bit, that's like 25% or less of the image is going to be used that color. So for example here, mostly red, there's red kind of in most parts of this picture, and then just in kind of the outside or the top, there's this kind of blue and maybe a little bit of green at the bottom. Another really easy technique to get just nice colors in your render is kind of go a bit more monochromatic. So monochromatic doesn't mean black and white, although that is monochromatic. It just means using the same shade or the same hue for most of, if not all of the picture. So for example here, if I click around with my eyedropper and I kind of look at, if you look at the hue, which is this section right here, this is like the saturation left and right, and then the brightness up and down. That's going to be fluctuating a lot in here, but the hue, if I click around, is actually going to be in a very small range. So if I click around, you can see a lot of the tones in here are that same orange, yellow kind of tone, even at the bottom, same thing. Even in the dark shadows, it's the same color. So it's monochromatic. It's the same kind of color used just at different brightness values and different saturation values all over the image, and everything goes together because it's the same color, right? So that's another way that you can do this. Same thing in this one, like a lot of very, very similar shades of blue and green. Obviously there's this, bright yellow thing right here, but I could have it all blue and it would look fine as well. So that's, again, another very easy way to get nice colors that go together. Is just use similar or the same shade and just use different hues or different values and saturations rather. Right, like even if I click over here, it's the same. If you look at the hue over here, same hue, but it's much darker. It's just the brightness has been brought down. The saturation is a bit different. Yeah. I'll talk about saturation in a bit afterwards in the actual edits I've done here. But I think what I want to do right now is go into Blender and show you the exact settings that I've used to actually get these colors here. So something you'll notice is in Blender, the saturation is much lower than it was in Photoshop. So I'll generally keep it somewhat desaturated and not super intense in Blender. And then in Photoshop, that's where I'll just crank it and adjust the color so it matches and works a bit better. But you can see in here, there's actually the hue of all these signs and stuff is a little bit different. Like this red, I turned to pink later. This kind of blue up here got a bit more like cyan greenish. All that I did in Photoshop, and obviously the pink is much less saturated. So in Blender, I'm not as worried about that because it's much easier to manipulate colors in Photoshop than in Blender, I find. So if I click on one of these signs here, for example, let's actually look at the exact settings I've used here. If I can click on this. There we go. So it's some image that's just some random colors. If I just go to the UV editor, we can probably see this. So just some image. There's a bunch of extra stuff, hue, saturation, and all that. I don't think that's really doing anything, or it's making it darker. So the main thing that's happening in here is this node right here. There's all this extra stuff that doesn't really matter. If I just mute this node right here, you can see it was just white before, basically. So this is multiplying in. It's just a mix mix color node, and we're just switching it over from mix over to multiply. So the color from the image is going into slot A, and then slot B is getting multiplied into that color, into the original color. And you can see it's just this pink kind of color right here. So if I make this blue or whatever, that will affect what's going on here. Now it looks very saturated, like the saturation is turned up to 0.948, which looks very high, but in Blender, it's I think the saturation slider is not really linear. It kind of feels a bit more exponential. So the closer you get to the end, the faster it's going to get saturated as you go closer to 1. Whereas like down here, it's like very you can kind of see that visually too, where it like snaps up at the very end. So although it says 0.948, it's actually, if you look in the render here, it's not actually that saturated. And you know, in Photoshop, that's a pretty big difference. I've added much more saturation in here in post versus what it's at right here, right? That's generally how I like to do it. I pretty much always like to keep it somewhat desaturated in Blender, and for some reason that just is much easier and nicer to work with in Photoshop. And I find I can get a lot more out of it if I do it that way, versus if I start with something super saturated in Blender, for some reason I just don't get as nice results in Photoshop. I don't know if it's just because there's less room to work with, or maybe it just doesn't give me as much room to increase the saturation and bring out like the underlying textures underneath. Whatever it is, it just looks better, I find, if I keep it somewhat desaturated inside the 3D file and then in Photoshop, then obviously crank it there. So here's another example. So same thing. If we look back in Photoshop at this one, it's quite, it's very intense colors in here, but in Blender, it's not that saturated, right? Same thing, like here's what's happening here. It's this image. This was basically, this is getting turned into black and white and then getting run through this color ramp where it's just these colors that are getting outputted here. So if I just isolate this blue is actually not really affecting it. So you can ignore this blue handle in the color ramp. The main color that's happening, that's getting actually put into this thing, is this orange right here. And again, it looks like the saturation is high at 0.8 or 0.9. But if you look at this, it's not that saturated. You know, again, this is a pretty exponential slider. So if it was way up, and I could probably even, you know, increase this more if I added a hue saturation and cranked it more, like that is saturated right there. But if I go back to what it was, that's pretty desaturated compared to how it looks like I just did or in Photoshop. So again, I like to keep it like this because if you look at the textures in here, that is getting what brought out a lot in Photoshop when I add like clarity and CameraRa and all that stuff. And I find it kind of, when you have a texture with a lot of detail, actually, I'll actually just show you here the exact texture that I'm using here. I have this on the side. This texture is what is all over the walls and the rocks at the bottom. This texture right here, sorry, I just went to the wrong blend file, right here. So if I look at the shader for this, there was this on, but it's just making it a bit more shiny. But look at all the color information in this texture. And again, this is on all of the stone things, all the walls, all over the place in this render. So look at the amount of information we get in the color here. There's like light green, dark green, like browns, grays, like weird, like desaturated kind of beige colors. Lots of different colors in the color map of this texture. And what that means is you don't have to do that much in like lighting it with colorful lights to get a bunch of interesting colors. Like if we look at in Photoshop, look at all the interesting like greens and weird colors that are kind of at the bottom here. I didn't have to do much work. I just put the texture on it, put a red light, and then those two things combined with Photoshop, bringing out like the saturation and the contrast, that brings out some really interesting weird colors that look natural because it's being lit like the 3D engine is doing all the work of making the light bounce off and reflect naturally. So it just brings out like natural weird colors that you wouldn't really expect. And that just comes from using a texture that has a lot of color information in it rather than something just gray, you know? So that's a technique I'll do a lot to just automatically bring out interesting colors, is pick a texture that has lots of interesting colors already, then use colorful lights, and then that combined will just make something that is just it'll just bring out weird colors that you didn't really expect to be there, while still keeping it like nice. The main colors are going to be nice and complementary if you do that, if you kind of dial that in. But yeah, it's like, the texture you choose and the colors on the texture will have a big influence on how everything looks. And again, it doesn't look like that's doing much in 3D. Like, it's kind of something you have to do over and over again and bring it through Photoshop to kind of see how that's going to affect it. But it looks pretty just gray in here. Again, but the CameraRa filter and those settings are what really brings that out. And I can show you that right now, actually. Okay, so let's take a look in Photoshop at the exact settings that I've used to bring it from what it was in Blender, like this, all the way to the finished result of these really vibrant colors. So there's a lot of edits I did before the CameraRa filter, but this isn't really having that much of an effect on the colors. I'm making some areas darker and brighter and adding some effects and stuff, but the main thing that transforms the colors of the image is going to be the CameraRa filter right here. So the way you do this is select the top layer of your layer stack in Photoshop. Press Control-Alt-Shift-E. What that does is it duplicates all the layers, merges them all together into one new layer. So you just have all of your edits combined into one layer at the top, and whatever you do to this won't destroy all the previous things you've done. Once you have that, go to Filter, Convert for Smart Filters, and then Filter, CameraRa filter. And now you can go back, since it's a smart filter, you can go back and change the settings anytime in the CameraRa. I have other videos on my full Photoshop workflow, but this is just mostly about colors, so I'm not going to go too in depth there. But let's look at the CameraRa filter. So this is, that's bringing out a lot of those colors I was talking about, where it looks kind of like gray here, then it brings it out through this. So let's look at what's going on here. If I open this up, let's take a look. So first of all, the saturation is getting increased straight off the bat. I don't think any of this other stuff really has that much of an effect on the color. Like I said, the clarity can bring out some details that weren't really visible there before. But the main thing is just, like, it's not that complicated. Like, you bring up the saturation slider, and that makes a big difference. You can see there. The other thing, too, is sometimes the color mixer looks really cool, and you can just manipulate each different hue in your image. So if I want to make the orange just a bit more pink, I can bring that this way, or if I want to make it more yellow, I can bring it that way. That can have a really massive effect on the image sometimes. In this case, I didn't actually use it, but the other thing too is color grading. So sometimes, like in this image right here, we're kind of already getting blue in the shadows of this picture from this like spotlight at the top. So sometimes it looks nice to kind of add that a little bit more by adding some blue just into the shadows naturally like this. Even if you don't have a blue light source in the render, just adding like a cool color into the shadows, I find it can look really nice sometimes and help balance out if you have a really warm image. Just kind of split toning it like this with some blue can look really nice, or whatever color makes sense to use. But the other thing too is this calibration section at the bottom. This is kind of like the color mixer that I was showing earlier, which I didn't actually use, but it's kind of just a more, I don't really know what's different about it, but it's kind of just a different version of that. You only get three sections, like the red, green, and blue to work with. But for some reason, this just has a different look than doing it in the color mixer, I find. So you can see if I hide this, that is actually doing quite a bit of work there, cranking the red saturation and bringing up the blue saturation a little bit. If I bring this down, you can see that is doing a lot there. If I want to increase the saturation in any of these sliders here, it just does a more clean job than using the main like overall saturation slider. I don't really know why, but it just has a different look to it than the main just overall saturation, bringing that up. And again, here I'm adjusting the hue, so we went from that orange kind of to this more red orange kind of color, and then saturating that. And that's pretty much it. Like this section down here, the color mixer and the saturation are going to be the main things that you use to enhance the colors. At least that's what I do. So let me get out of here, and then after that, there's a color lookup, which isn't really doing anything. Yeah, it's basically doing nothing. And then a curves layer, and then I think I put one more hue saturation above everything. It's at plus 24, so that's just saturating it even more than it already was. Yeah, that's a good example of like how I manipulate the colors in my scenes to just be very, very vibrant and look nice. Okay, yeah, that's it. So I don't know, go make some really colorful, vibrant renders, or just try that technique of like picking colors on the opposite side of the spectrum. It's a really easy way to get nice complementary colors. It doesn't have to be that complicated. And yeah, um, thanks for watching. If you want to go really in depth into my environment creation process, there's a course link below which you can check out if you want. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in some other video. Bye.